From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Potomac Watch.
Republicans join with Democrats to raid Social Security and hand that money over to government union workers. It's an early sign of just how costly the GOP's tentative embrace of labor unions may prove to be. What other policies could come out of that budding alliance? Welcome to Potomac Watch. I am Kim Strassel. I am here this week with my colleagues Alicia Finley and Mene Ukwe-Burua. So one of the features of this past election was Donald Trump's new overtures to unions. And this has been driven by a number of factors: his new emphasis on courting blue-collar voters, the rise of what we're calling national conservatives who have very different views on trade unionism, the decision by some union leaders this election to withhold a Democratic endorsement. So all fueling this outreach by Republicans to big labor. Yet this move to make nice, to cozy up with union bosses, holds with it some big policy problems and political trade-offs. And we're seeing an example of that playing out at the end of this Congress. The House last month passed the Social Security Fairness Act, 327 to 75, which, put briefly, will change Social Security rules in a way that showers almost $200 billion on government workers. Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer is promising a Senate vote on the bill before the week is out. And let's listen to Schumer on Monday in the Senate talking about that vote.
We will vote, and every senator will choose. Where are you? Do you stand on the side of public retirees who deserve their benefits, or bungle this golden opportunity by blocking this bill?
Alicia, it strikes me that the name of this legislation somewhat misses the mark. It's a little bit like the Inflation Reduction Act. This fight over Social Security rules, this one actually goes all the way back to the 1980s when lawmakers fixed a quirk in the Social Security program that basically awarded government union workers an outsized benefit compared to Americans who earn the same amount in the private sector. That fix back then was a good thing, but unions have been complaining about it ever since. And now suddenly Congress seems poised to give them that handout again. Why don't you tell us what the problem is here in the law and what this legislation would actually do?
So many government workers, state level government workers, do not contribute to Social Security, and neither do their employers pay into it. And this is in part because they get pensions, defined benefit pensions that are in many cases very generous nowadays. You hear all the time about public government workers retiring with pensions over 100,000, even 200, 300,000 in many cases, where they can earn a lot of overtime and then spike their pensions. So these folks do not pay into Social Security, but some do when they work in the private sector. So it's not actually unusual nowadays for a police officer or a firefighter to retire in his early 50s and then go work 10 or some odd more years part-time for a security agency or just, in private business. And during that time, they are required to pay into Social Security. Now, because of an artifact of the Social Security formula, which is based on the highest 35 years on average earnings, as well as how much you contribute, these workers end up earning outsized benefits, as you mentioned, because they are progressively indexed. And what that means is essentially for all those years that they were government workers making $200,000 or so. I mean, that's probably high for most government workers, but they're not compensated poorly in most cases. Those years are counted as zero earnings in the formula, thereby holds down the average earnings, and therefore they end up earning relatively bigger replacement rates. Right. And so as a result, they actually end up getting bigger benefits than people who work their entire careers in the private sector. And this 1983 amendment was intended to correct that. And what also they did in 1977, this involves spousal benefits, which probably really aren't necessary, but a similar quirk resulted in government workers earning spousal benefits, even though they didn't contribute to Social Security. And this government pension offset in 1977 was intended to correct that. Now, government unions have long been pushing to repeal these provisions in order to boost their Social Security check.
So we're essentially poised on the edge of going back to a system, one that Congress had already fixed, but back to a system where people who work in government jobs, teacher, firefighter, just a government union employee, they get big pension benefits. Then many of them retire at the age of 50 or so. They go work in the private sector. And now if we change the system back, we're going to go back to one in which they're both going to get huge benefits from their pension, but also outsized benefits from Social Security, at least by comparison to other people who worked in similarly earning jobs in the private sector their entire life. And, Monet, a couple of things strike me about this. One is the cost. It's going to cost close to $200 billion over 10 years to do this. It's coming at a time when Social Security is already poised on insolvency in the near future. It's also a fairness issue because, like I noted, people who are working the same number of years in the private sector are not going to get this kind of a payoff. So it's like a bonus essentially for serving government. It also, my understanding is that the way that this would work is that not only is there the unfairness in that, but higher earning government workers will also benefit to a greater extent than lower earning government workers. But here's what I don't understand, Monet, and maybe you can explain it to me. This bipartisan rush to give this handout to public sector union employees is coming at the same time that Americans are embracing school choice in a pushback to those unions and the tyranny that Randi Weingarten and her teachers' unions impose over public education. It's coming at the same time that Donald Trump has asked Elon Musk and Vivek Ramaswamy to come in and go to town on the bureaucracy, which, by the way, that bureaucracy are unionized federal workers. So am I missing something here, or is this just total cognitive dissonance?
Part of the explanation is very simple. It's bleak, but very simple. And that's to say, when a problem in Washington is so huge that it's going to take a lot of effort and a lot of time to fix, often you see lawmakers decide, well, there's no harm in making it a little bit worse than it already is because the solution is going to be so far off. If Social Security is already insolvent and is on pace to run out of money in its trust fund by 2032, I think a lot of these lawmakers, including a lot of Senate Republicans who co-sponsored this provision, said to themselves, we can afford to give a little giveaway. What's a couple $100 million to please some of our constituents? Billion, correct. And then we're going to finally get around to some kind of grand compromise to fix it, but that will come later down the road. So does it really make a difference if we make the problem worse for now for a short-term political benefit? I do think that the stranger question is why these Republicans thought that it was in their political interest to appease these union workers. I think that a lot of Americans who have seen their cost of living increase in the past few years and have seen that their own retirement isn't going to go as far as they thought are going to look at something like this and wonder why they're not getting special treatment from their elected representatives. And that's particularly true when the beneficiaries are teachers' unions, as you mentioned, who I think a lot of people have become more aware of the ways that they've structured the system to their benefit at the expense of students. But I do think that in the long run, Republicans are going to have to decide whether they are going to continue to prioritize reforms that keep costs low for Americans overall, or are going to try to pivot in a direction of appeasing union interests.
Yeah, and the handouts that come with that. By the way, that was very bleak, Monet, but also I think very accurate. So, thank you. We're going to take a break. When we come back, more on Republicans and the union agenda. Welcome back. I'm Kim Strassel here with my colleagues, Monet Ukwe-Barua and Alicia Finley. One belief out there is that among the reasons Republicans are doing this is because the International Association of Firefighters, who have been some of the ringleaders in Washington trying to roll this fix back, decided not to endorse Democrats this year. And by withholding that endorsement, essentially, gave license to their members to more freely vote for Donald Trump and Republicans. Alicia, is this likely to pass? Obviously, it passed with huge numbers in the House. And I believe there are 13 Senate co-sponsors. I guess the question now is simply, does the Senate have time before it bolts at the end of the week, given Senate rules? And also, this does expire if it's not passed before the end of the year, correct?
Right. So I think it will pass. I mean, it's a matter of getting everyone to show up who supports it on the Republican side, and that includes J.D. Vance, who has been not present for some judicial votes to oppose Biden's nominee. So it'll be interesting if he gets into town and makes this vote, because they will need almost all Democrats and most of the 13 Republicans who have co-sponsored this to show up. And I think part of when they co-sponsored the Republicans, to Monee's point, that they thought this was kind of a freebie, that they could signal their support to the unions. They weren't really considering the ramifications. I mean, especially kind of strange as Rick Scott's support. And here he is portraying himself, presenting himself as a deficit hawk. But here his support for this and a vote for this would belie that. Now, the unions, to your point, the biggest unions supporting it are the Firefighters Association, and they did not endorse in the election. So maybe the Republicans in the House who went along with this, and that was about half of the Republicans, they consider this just a payoff, which I think is kind of a payoff for the union's decision not to endorse, which is kind of ridiculous because they could have endorsed Trump if they wanted to. So this was really why are you giving this payday to a union that, isn't actually endorsing you? And the Trump did that again when he nominated Lori Chavez Romero as his labor secretary in return for Sean O'Brien, the Teamsters president's decision not to endorse in the election.
Yeah, that's something I actually kind of want to get into. Some of the other things that have already happened or coming down the road. By the way, on this legislation, I think the one thing that could actually hold it back is the Senate's running short on time. And if you had, for instance, a Republican like Rand Paul who wanted to object, you could potentially delay it to a point, and he would have time on his side because everybody wants to get out of town so badly. So I still think it's maybe a jump shot. But, if you look at how we got here just quickly, I mean, I think some of this new cozying up to unions, it comes out of the rise of what, as I noted, we're calling the national conservative movement, that's gone all in on saying Republicans must be the party of the working class. And there's nothing wrong with that. Indeed, that was a kind of theme, albeit not a fully defined theme, of Trump's first run. But what we've seen is some in the GOP really take that and run with it and double down on the more populist nature of it, and ended up in a place where supposedly Republicans need to be lockstep with labor unions. My problem with that is that the reason conservatives have long been at odds with organized labor is that organized labor is by and large anti-worker. They exist to strip away an individual's right to forge their own destiny in their workplace. They charge these punishing union dues, which they throw at politics. Union leadership has a long history and problems with a lack of transparency and at times corruption. And it's why it's been a longstanding policy that Republicans support right to work. For instance, we've had great advances there. I think more than half of our states are right to work. I don't think Republicans need to be hostile to unions, but where we're going at the moment, I mean, just to get to another example is, Monet, if you look out there, and Alicia just brought this up, the other big gift to unions already, in addition to this legislation, is Trump's labor pick, Lori Chavez DeRaymer. She's an Oregon congresswoman, but recently lost her election. She was the straight up union pick for this job. I mean, can you tell us a little bit more about her and some of the concerns about having her at the Department of Labor?
Yeah, well, the biggest sign of worry regarding Lori Chavez DeRaymer is the fact that she was in favor of the PRO Act, which included many of those provisions that you just described. She also has quite a large local base of support from unions in her former Oregon district, and has tight relationships with them, and has given every sign that she is going to be taking up her agenda in part from the advice that she gets from these unions. But I do think that you have to worry with the direction that Trump has gone, particularly with nominating her, that there will be the resurrection of the PRO Act in some kind of form. Maybe it will be stripped down of some of the more controversial elements. But the fact that Democrats are going to be trying to see if they can strike some kind of compromise with Republicans to at least get some of those provisions passed, which would have the effect of pleasing a lot of the unions, but really detrimental effects for workers around the country. I think right to work is the biggest example of that. I think it's really impossible to call yourself pro-worker while also being against national right to work. If you imagine the perspective of a young person who's applying for a position, wants to go work in an auto plant, but looks at the United Auto Workers and says, what has this union really done for its employees? Have they managed to actually increase wages? There's little evidence of that. In fact, you see plants closing in the areas where everyone's forced to join the union and relocating to the right to work areas. They're also taking political positions on a whole bunch of progressive causes that a lot of American working people don't favor. And so is that applicant going to want to have to pay hundreds of dollars a year in dues just because he wants to work in that industry? I don't think that's true. And Republicans, I think, have done well by advocating that position historically. And it would be a huge mistake to trade that away to try to align with the interests of the institutional unions at the expense of the people who are actually working and providing the votes for Republicans in the end.
Yeah, I'm very worried about a revival of portions of the PRO Act. I'm very concerned about a Department of Labor, which historically under Republican presidents have worked very hard to increase transparency of union funding and union operations, which is something that remains way too in the shadows.